Hi, I'm Jerry Sparks, President of AG Financial Insurance Solutions, and we have with us today Rich Hammer, attorney, CPA, best-selling author on church law and taxes, and a Harvard Law graduate. And thanks, Rich, for coming back with us.
Thanks, Jerry.
So we're here to talk about Risk Management Live, and first of all, we just want to say, for those people that are going through Hurricane Sandy, you're in our prayers, and if you have damage, we want you to be able to contact your insurance agent. If you can't get a hold of your insurance agent, call the company direct. They're going to have special claims crews handling these claims with this kind of disaster. I was listening last night to the TV, and they were saying that this could be the largest disaster as far as a hurricane in history because of the amount of people that are affected with it. If you need to secure your premises, go ahead and do so. Insurance coverage does cover that, just to keep your premises secure. So we wanted to let you know that, and you're in our prayers for that. Last month we talked about volunteers, and we're going to just do a little summary of what we talked about. You can go to the previous TV spot that we had and watch this if you want to, but we're going to do a little summary here. If you when you're picking volunteers, selecting and supervising your volunteers, you need to have a written application. In that written application, you need to ask certain questions. That application is online. You need to get references from people that know of their ability to work with children. Remember to use 2 adults at all times with the child, so no child is left alone with 1 adult. Supervision, you need to make sure that you're adequately supervising the children. Watch out for hazardous and avoid hazardous activities if at all possible. And now we're going to talk a little bit about vicarious liability and how that affects volunteers.
Yes, well, Jerry, vicarious liability simply means A is liable for something that B does. And how does that relate to volunteers? Our topic for our last session and today is that a church can be vicariously liable for the actions of volunteers, just as it can for its employees. It's the same rule. And the point is that any negligent act by a volunteer committed in the course of that person performing his or her responsibilities on behalf of the church can be imputed to the church. And so the church can be liable even though it had nothing to do with it directly, and maybe, in fact, discouraged or prohibited the type of behavior that was engaged in. Let me give you an example. Let's say that a church has a policy, which I recommend, a cell phone policy, that no cell phones can be utilized, certainly not for text messaging or for calls, while driving a vehicle on church business of any kind. And so that's a policy that prohibits that type of behavior. If a volunteer disregards that policy, then the church obviously can be responsible, even though it prohibited the type of behavior that was engaged in that caused the injury. And so we see the same thing in other contexts as well, such as driving a vehicle just in general. This is a very frequent claim for churches, is that a volunteer or employee was driving a vehicle, maybe a church vehicle, maybe their own vehicle, on some church business and was negligent in driving, maybe went through a red light, maybe was speeding, caused an accident, injured or killed somebody. The church can be responsible for that if the volunteer was acting in the course of his or her duties on behalf of the church.
Yeah, actually, we have seen this happen way too many times, and it happens in all businesses, but churches aren't exempt in that. A lot of churches will have volunteers, whether they're transporting children or going to a field trip, if they're a school, where they have volunteers and they utilize volunteers versus hiring a bus, utilizing that vehicle. At AG Financial, we actually came up with a form to help protect the churches, and we'll make this available to everybody online. But what it does is it puts a lot of the risk management portion to protect the church and letting the church know that the people have minimum coverages, number one. Number two, what their to-dos are, so that people know what what they need to do and what is required of them. So let me just give you a little bit of what we came up with. It'll actually have the driver's name, and it'll say, specify their insurance coverage. They're going to maintain the appropriate levels, the minimum limits that we set. They'll provide a copy of the insurance policy to the church. They will actually give them a copy of their driver's license so they can run a background check and make sure that they do not have that they do have a driver's license and their driver's license is valid. If they're convicted of more than one minor traffic violation or have more than one at-fault accident, they got to notify them. And here's where it comes to vehicle safety. It says a number of passengers with working seat belts in this vehicle. So you know that you have a seat belt for every person that is in that vehicle. As required by law, I guarantee that all occupants will be wearing those seat belts. And while this vehicle is being operated, I will comply with the safety requirements of the vehicle, but not limited, of this vehicle, including but not limited to airbags. So if there's airbags, they will not make them inoperable. The operation or the automobile being driven for this specific event is in good working operation. So you know that the car can make it there and back, and you know you don't have problems with it. And I will caravan with this group, and we'll keep close contact with the church staff during this trip. So you don't have people going off on their own with 6 kids in the car and you don't know what happened to them. So all of this basically puts the onus basically back on the volunteer and gives a little bit added protection back to the church.
Very good. Well, and then Jerry, you think I think some people have asked us this question, and that is, in fact, you and I both are working on a case right now in another state where there was a van rollover and several children were injured. One was killed because the youth pastor fell asleep at the wheel of the van because he'd been in an all-night lock-in the night before with these kids. This is just one reason why I absolutely oppose lock-ins. Where do we see this in church history? That kids, adolescents, are warehoused, locked into a building, fed stimulating beverages and foods, stay up all night watching videos and playing games, and are zombies for the next week in school. Where in Scripture do we see this practice? I mean, I think it's abhorrent. And here, this youth pastor falls asleep, causes a horrific accident. And one of the issues in that case is whether there's any insurance coverage. And one of the issues that arose was the whole issue of who was named as an additional insured on the insurance policy. And that also swerves into the non-owned vehicle coverage. You might want to comment on those briefly.
Yeah, one of the things that we suggest every church covers is hired and non-owned automobile. And what actually happens a lot of times is if you have a person running an errand for the church, whether it's going to the bank, making the deposit, going to get the mail, or if they're doing an activity where we have them transporting children in their own vehicle, hired and non-owned liability will automatically give liability coverage to the church for that incident, even though the primary coverage will be under the person that is actually driving in their vehicle because insurance follows the specific car. It will give the church additional liability if there is an accident in anything. One of our largest cases was a hired and non-owned liability where a person was going to the post office, and when they went to the post office, they had an accident. Just happened to run into an attorney with a Mercedes. The wife was actually a neurosurgeon. So it was a very, very large claim, and the person had the state minimum limits. $10,000 property damage, and you run into a $60,000 vehicle, $25,000 bodily injury, just for the lady to be off work with a broken hand. Okay, that claim came in. It was settled for over $900,000 because she could not operate and do surgery for a while. So, hired and non-owned automobile coverage, you need to make sure that you do have that coverage on your policy.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Well, let's move on then to the next issue that comes to mind when we're talking about volunteers in churches, and that's the whole subject of discrimination laws. You know, there are many, many discrimination laws at the federal, state, and sometimes at the local level, municipal level, that churches may or may not be subject to, depending on a range of conditions. But many churches are subject to at least some of these discrimination laws that prohibit various types of discrimination in any kind of employment decision. Well, the important thing to point out is that these laws are directed at the employment relationship and generally do not apply to volunteers that are uncompensated. Now, the test for an employee is broad, but as long as you're not paying that person anything in terms of cash, wages, or in-kind benefits such as food or lodging, that person is generally not considered an employee and is a volunteer. So what that means is these discrimination laws may not apply. And of course, that'll depend on the specific language of each law involved. But for example, if you have an opening for a youth worker in your church high school group, a volunteer position, and you have a 90-year-old woman apply for that job, some churches might say, you're too old for that job. Well, is that age discrimination? Absolutely. Now, you can not hire somebody as an employee if you're subject to an age discrimination law based on their inability to perform the essential functions of the job. But just to have an absolute rule that you're too old to work with our youth, that is likely not going to violate an age discrimination law to the extent that person is not an employee. So that's an important clarification to make. Now let's get into the next topic with regard to employees, Jerry, and this is, I think, of great interest to most of our viewers, and that's this whole issue of limited liability. And the point here is this. Most states have enacted laws that provide limited immunity from liability for uncompensated officers or directors with regard to their ordinary acts of negligence. Now, many of these laws also apply to volunteers generally, not just to officers and directors of a nonprofit organization, but also to volunteer workers. The key is that they've got to be uncompensated, and these laws generally only protect against ordinary negligence. That's why they're called limited immunity from liability. It's not absolute immunity, it's limited because these laws do not apply to willful, criminal, wanton acts or acts that are deemed to be grossly negligent. What we're talking about here is behavior that borders on recklessness. Now let me give you three examples of, just three, of what might be deemed to be gross negligence. And one would be a church that says, we're not going to, or let's say a church board that says, we're not going to screen workers that work with minors in our church. We don't need to do that. That's a sensationalized topic. That doesn't apply to us. That's a perfect example, I think, of a church board that may be guilty of reckless or gross negligence, which does what? It abrogates the limited immunity and exposes those individual board members to personal liability. I think a second one would be not controlling the use of cell phones by church staff when they're driving on church business. Letting people text message. Just imagine somebody, an employee of your church or volunteer, that is engaged in text messaging while on church business, causes a horrific accident in which people are killed. Yes, the church is going to be liable under those circumstances, but the point we're making here is, what about those volunteer officers and directors, the volunteer board members? Can they say, well, we're not liable because we have immunity from liability under state and federal law? That's not necessarily going to be the case if that's deemed to be grossly negligent. And here's the third one, and that is a church board that otherwise would have limited immunity, but authorize or do not control or prohibit the use of 15-passenger vans. I'm involved in a case right now. It's the Lockins case I mentioned before, where the youth pastor fell asleep in a van. Every one of the teenagers in that van, of which there were about 15, was injured. One was killed. And here's the interesting thing. Not only has the church been sued by some of these victims, but also the members of the board of that church were individually sued. That was a real wake-up call. that was a shocker for these board members to be served a lawsuit by a deputy at their front door. And I'll tell you what, they've gotten very serious about this. And the point is this: you authorized the use of a 15-passenger van despite all the media attention on the inherent risks of these vehicles, and you allowed minors, of all people, to be stuffed into that vehicle and did not comply with any of the recommendations by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And so, board, yes, the church is liable too, but we're going after you personally. And this could have catastrophic consequences because of the amount of damages involved.
You know, one of the things that happened with that case is that, you know, you do have board members that are serving on that board have no idea that they're liable. There's a good chance that they will be held liable. But what people really need to watch is, you know, when things go to court and we get into the limited immunity, what is considered gross negligence? What would a prudent man do? What would the church prudently do? And if they're not doing what is considered prudent, or what would be, you know, normal to protect somebody, they're going to be held liable.
Yeah, what the courts would say, the exercise of reasonable care under the circumstances. And that's ordinary negligence, for which they will be given immunity. The lack of immunity applies when their behavior goes beyond ordinary negligence and becomes grossly negligent, which borders on recklessness. And that's why I gave those 3 examples of how, but there are many others that could be given, of how there could be gross negligence that would subject those board members to personal liability. Let me emphasize, Jerry, this limited immunity from liability only extends to uncompensated officers, directors, and volunteers in many cases. So it's very important to know whether you're getting compensated. You mentioned to me earlier today about a church that gives a $100 gift certificate to the members of the board during the holiday season, just as a show of appreciation for the work they do. Well, I mean, is it worth a $100 gift certificate to eliminate the limited immunity from liability that would otherwise apply? That's why, as a member of my church board, at our annual holiday dinner, I refuse to have a $30 or $40 dinner served to me. And so I always bring a sack lunch and sit in the corner. And the board says, "Oh, there he goes again." They can eat in silence, secrecy, and shame. But I'm kidding. But I do sit there and have that dinner with a sense of foreboding. Am I here? Is this a mess of pottage and I'm selling my birthright? Am I selling my limited immunity for the sake of this this dinner?
Yeah, one of the things
it bothers me.
Yeah, one of the things that churches really need to do to protect those people that are serving on the board, and I know that you've served on a church board and you serve on several other boards, is you need to make sure that the church is providing directors and officers liability.
Yes.
And that they have proper limits to protect you. Because who are the people that normally serve on the board? They're going to be your doctors, your high-income people that will give to the church a lot of times, are the people that are serving on the board. You want to make sure that you're protecting them.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's go ahead and move on, Jerry, to a couple of other issues. And let's talk about the Fair Labor Standards Act, whether you have to pay overtime, or let me say this, the subject of volunteer workers comes up under the Fair Labor Standards Act, that's the minimum wage and overtime law, because of the fact that many employers, including many churches, try to avoid having to pay overtime by having a worker work additional hours as a volunteer. Many times the worker volunteers to do it. You don't have to pay me. I'm going to work my 40 hours as the church secretary or the church bookkeeper or the church custodian, but I'm going to work another 10 or 15 hours this week. And I know it's a tight time for the church financially, and so don't pay me. I'm volunteering my services. And that's well-intentioned, and that's a noble impulse. But the fact is that the church is going to be potentially subject to a significant liability because the Department of Labor has made it clear you cannot volunteer to perform the same work for which you are being compensated as a paid employee. You can't do it. Now, you can theoretically volunteer to do other types of work, but the more hours you volunteer and the more weeks that you do this volunteer work, the more likely the Department of Labor is going to consider you to be an employee, not a volunteer, for which time and a half is required. And there could be significant liabilities that accumulate quickly. Now, a related issue we wanted to mention briefly is workers' comp. Most churches have workers' comp insurance. Many think that they're exempt from it and don't have it, but that's a huge gap in their insurance coverage, isn't it?
It is. And actually, who are you looking to protect under work comp? Normally, the pastor sometimes is the only paid employee, or the church secretary. The person that we really want to protect is that pastor, and it provides for medical coverage if he is hurt while on the job, plus it will cover his disability if he's disabled. It will cover his payroll until he can get back up and operational. So we want to make sure that we're covering the pastor. But then you look at, is something covered under work comp, or is it general liability because there's a fine line. Are they a volunteer or are they an employee? And we've had this happen in several cases. As you know, we did have a church that had a camp, and we had a person injured at the camp, and the work comp carrier said this person is a volunteer.
So there's no workers' comp.
So no work comp coverage. So they denied the claim.
And it was catastrophic.
It was catastrophic. And the general liability carrier said this person was paid something. It was not cash. It was paid something, and we're considering them an employee because basically, if they're paid anything, like you said, lodging, food, any of those things at a camp, it could be considered compensation, and they can be considered an employee. So it's real important. One of the important things to do is make sure that your work comp and your general liability are with the same carrier.
Yes. Yeah, that is so good. So in that case, the fact that the person was paid for 2 hours of work and also received some food and lodging accommodations, there was a dispute whether that was enough to make that person an employee. But it was a big decision, a big issue for the church, because you're looking at a multi-million-dollar claim in that case, and it was eventually determined that the person was an employee. Now think about this. Because the person was an employee, the church's workers' comp carrier provided full compensation and benefits to that person for this catastrophic injury. What if the church had decided, Jerry, like so many, well, we're exempt from workers' comp because we're a church. We're not going to have workers' the church would have borne that liability itself, multiple millions of dollars, because it didn't have the workers' comp. So the point is this: we're talking about volunteers here, and workers' comp. Why we're bringing up workers' comp? Because that deals with employees. That's right, it does deal with employees, not volunteers. But the term employee, and here's the point, is interpreted very broadly in every state, so that many people who you think are volunteers are going to be deemed to be employees. And if they're deemed to be employees, your general liability policy, one of the first exclusions is for injuries to employees in the course of their work, because it's assumed that you have workers' comp to cover that. And if you don't have workers' comp, there you go. You got a big hole in your coverage. So assume that the term volunteer is going to be interpreted very broadly in the context of workers' comp. That's a reason, among others, why you need workers' comp insurance.
One of the things, too, that happens is that under work comp, in some states, you can actually add volunteers under your work comp, so you don't have any questions whether or not there is coverage.
That is an excellent point.
We do have some questions, and if you do have a question, you can actually type it at the bottom of the area where you're looking at the screen, and type in your question, and we'll get to your question. We do have some questions, so I just figured
before we get to those, let me just mention one other thing that occurred to me earlier, just before our broadcast today. One other issue that I think, that I get asked this all the time, especially during the holidays. We're going to give our volunteers at our church a gift certificate to Starbucks or somewhere else, or we're going to give them some kind of in-kind compensation, a turkey or a ham or something like that. Is that taxable income? And I'm asked this all the time. And the answer is yes, it's taxable income. But if that person is not a paid staff member, you don't have to add it to a W-2 because they don't get a W-2. It's a matter of issuing them a 1099, which is only required if you pay them over $600 of compensation during the year. And we're talking $5, $10, $20, maybe $50 in these cases. So you never, or very rarely, are you giving $600 or more of value to a volunteer as a token of appreciation. So in that case, while it is taxable income, and you might share that with the employee, with the volunteer, it's totally up to that person to report that that benefit as additional taxable income on his or her tax return. You know, are they going to do it? Are they going to report a $5 Starbucks card? That's not your problem. That's up to the individual.
It must be that you're reading somebody's mind, because actually one of the questions are, do gift cards count as compensation?
Well, you see, Jerry, I learned long ago that a good attorney not only anticipates the questions they're going to be asked, but anticipates the answers to be given to those anticipated questions. So there you go.
Yeah, actually we did have two questions.
And let me make this observation. Yes, there is something called a DeMinimis fringe benefit under Section 132 of the tax code, which says that if an employer provides DeMinimis benefits to an employee that are so administratively difficult or impracticable to determine their value because they're so small, you don't have to report that as taxable income. The examples are fruitcakes, hams, and turkeys given during the holidays. That's right in the regulations. But that doesn't apply to any gesture or token that whose value can be readily ascertainable, the regulations say. That includes a gift certificate. So if you get a $5 gift certificate, that is taxable income. And if it's an employee, you accumulate that on their W-2. That's not de minimis. But if you give that same employee a box of donuts, that's not taxable. I wrote an article on this once called Donuts Yes, Gift Certificates No.
Well, and actually, so we answered the question, do gift cards count as compensation?
Yes.
What about a volunteer appreciation banquet given in their honor?
Oh, now there you go. That's a good one. Volunteer appreciation banquet given in their honor. I think a reasonable argument there can be made that it falls under the token benefit exception. And there are tax court cases that have reached that conclusion, such as an office party to commemorate the retirement of a worker. There's a case that directly addresses that's the kind of thing that is considered to be a de minimis fringe benefit. It's not regular, it's not periodic, it's not the weekly lunch for the staff that you all go out to restaurants and eat and consider that's not a business expense. That's a taxable benefit because it's recurring, and the bottom line is this: why couldn't you perform that work at church? Why couldn't you have your business discussions in the church, in a church office somewhere? So that's why that's a different case.
We did a pretty good job of answering those. We do have a question: if a volunteer uses their own personal car for church business, can the church be held liable? And I think we answered that. They can be held liable. What the person also needs to realize is that they can be held liable also, in addition to the church. And the church policy does not necessarily protect them individually.
And Jerry, getting back, that reminds me of another point we need to make. The fact that volunteers may have limited immunity from liability does not mean the church is immune from liability. The church is subject to liability for the ordinary or gross negligence of its employees or volunteers. The fact that the volunteer may have some limited immunity does not affect the church's liability.
We appreciate your time, and again, we're once again out of time. Boy, time travels quick when we get into this. But we appreciate your time, and what we're going to look at next week, or next month, I should say, is we're going to talk about church safety, and we're going to talk a little bit about how conceal and carry affects churches.
Conceal and carry weapons.
Conceal and carry weapons, and because that is a big topic, and that's one of the most talked about topics.
Yes.
How do we handle conceal carry with our individuals? So we're going to be talking about that next time. Join us next month, and if you haven't signed up to get an email in regards to when these happen, go to the right of the screen, fill in your name and email, and we'll get you the information. Plus, all the forms that we talk about, like the driving form, we'll send to you automatically. We appreciate your time and appreciate you being here. Be safe.